Let's now go over the anatomy of the heart. This large blood vessel coming out of the top of the heart here, coming actually out of the left ventricle, is called the aorta. The aorta transports blood to all parts of the body, including the lungs, but not primarily to the lungs. This blood vessel coming out of the right side of the heart is called the pulmonary trunk, and it transports blood to the lungs to get more oxygen. This blood vessel coming from the superior part of the body, the head and neck region, is the superior vena cava. The valve that closes once blood is pumped out of the right ventricle is called the pulmonic valve. The area of the heart that the superior vena cava dumps its blood into is the right atrium. The area of the heart that the pulmonary vein bumps its blood into is called the left atrium. The coronary sinus is the area that takes blood and from the heart and puts it into the right atrium. The valve that closes between the left atrium and the left ventricle is the mitral valve, or left AV canal. The valve that closes between the right atrium and the right ventricle is the right AV canal. Now, both of these canals are controlled by valves. The valve here is called the mitral valve, and the valve that closes from the left ventricle into the aorta is the aortic valve. On the right side, the valve that closes between the left atrium and the left ventricle is the tricuspid valve. These little cords that attach to the tricuspid valve are called the chordae tendineae, and they help hold the valve open when it needs to be open and allow it to shut when it needs to shut. The large chamber on the left is the left ventricle, and on the right is the right ventricle. The blood vessel that drains the bottom half of the body is the inferior vena cava. The part of the muscle that divides the left heart from the right heart is the interventricular septum. These muscles that hold the valve open when it needs to be open and close when it needs to be closed are the papillary muscles. And so these are the various structures in the heart as you look at it cut in half, so to speak. Now, if we look at it on the surface, on the left is the anterior surface of the heart. On the right is the posterior surface of the heart. We have this structure again, draining blood from the lower part, and on the left or on the right diagram, you can see it comes in the back half. This structure is called the inferior vena cava. The left side of the heart, from the front and the back, is the left ventricle. Again on the left, but in the upper part of the heart, is the left atrium. In your book, I think it's called auricle. I prefer the term atrium to auricle, but you can use either one. The vessels that drain into the left atrium from the lungs are called the pulmonary veins. The vessels that flow out of the heart into the lungs are called the pulmonary arteries. The vessel that comes out of the left ventricle and feeds the systemic circulation is called the aorta. The vessel that drains the superior part of the body, the head and neck region, is the superior vena cava. This area, if you look on the left, you see that it's on the top part on the right side of the heart. If you look at the diagram on the right, it's on the top and the inferior vena cava is coming into it. This is the right atrium. And so these are the various structures that we can see from the surface of the heart. Now this diagram shows the blood flow pattern through the heart. And in order to discuss blood flow, you have to start somewhere, okay? And I've talked about this briefly in a previous diagram, but let's talk about it in a little bit more detail in this diagram. We'll start on the right side, left side of this diagram, which is the right side of the heart as it's been cut. And you can see that it says the large vein from the top of the body, that's the superior vena cava, and the large vein from the bottom part or lower body is the inferior vena cava. Both of those dump into the right atrium. And you can see the arrow that comes from the top of the heart, the top of the large vein of the upper part of the body goes into the right atrium. It then passes through the tricuspid valve, which is not labeled on this diagram, and into the right ventricle. The right ventricle, upon contracting, sends blood out through the pulmonary veins, the pulmonary arteries, spoke wrong. And the pulmonary artery is the only artery that contains deoxygenated blood. In the process of being pumped out of the right ventricle and into the pulmonary artery, it goes across the pulmonary valve or pulmonic valve. Then you see on the right here, you see pulmonary veins from the left lung. It takes the blood into the left atrium. The pulmonary veins are the only veins in the body that carry oxygenated blood. It then is pumped through the mitral valve and into the left ventricle, where it is pumped out into the aorta through the aortic valve. And that is how blood flows through the heart. Now this shows the diagram of cardiac muscle, and cardiac muscle is actually quite unique. It's called a functional syncytium, and what that means is that once an impulse starts at one cell of the heart, it will travel throughout the entire heart. And this is accomplished primarily via this intercalated disc. You'll see on the diagram these connection points between heart cells. And the connection points between heart cells or cardiac cells are intercalated discs. And these discs, the way they're designed, line up in such a way as to allow messages to pass freely from one heart cell to the next heart cell, electrical impulses. So once an action potential starts in one heart cell, it travels throughout the entire heart. The heart is also unique in that it's self-stimulatory. And what that means is that heart muscle cells depolarize by themselves without any input from any outside source. And so a heart cell, if left alone, will slowly depolarize and then initiate an action potential without outside stimulus. And the frequency of these action potentials depends on where in the heart the cells are. If they're in the atria, they're much more rapid than if they're in the ventricles. Now the heart has a conduction system and a way of telling itself to beat without intervention from the outside. And the conduction system starts at the sinoatrial node. The sinoatrial node, which you can see on the left upper part of the diagram, which is actually the superior part of the right ventricle. This is a specialized bundle of cardiac tissues. This is what's called the pacemaker, and it initiates the cardiac contraction. Once it fires, as I said, it automatically conducts through both atria and causes both atria to contract. Now at the same time, messages travel down to the AV node, which is the atrioventricular node. And the purpose of the atrioventricular node is actually to slow the impulse down just a little bit to allow the atria to completely contract before the ventricles begin to contract. And then once it goes through the AV node, it then travels through the conduction system very rapidly, and the ventricles then contract. And in order to make this happen in a more efficient way, we have atrioventricular bundles, which are bundles of specialized tissue that conduct the impulse to the tip of the heart and allow the heart to contract from the bottom up instead of haphazardly. So these bundles that you see in black here allow for more rapid conduction that allows this to conduct in a more efficient and sequential fashion than it would if they didn't exist. The bundles, by the way, are made up of fibers known as Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers are basically the specialized tissue that do the conducting or allow for the conduction of the impulse. So when we look at the cardiac cycle, again, what happens during the cardiac cycle? Well, let's start. First of all, we have to define two terms. We have to define the term diastole, which means the phase in which the ventricles are relaxed, and then systole, which is the phase in which the ventricles are relaxed. Now, obviously, if we use the word atrial systole and ventricle systole, that means that the contraction is in the atria or in the ventricles. So if we start at early diastole, everything is relaxing. And the heart, essentially during this time, fills by passive filling from from the pulmonary side and from the systemic side. And there's continued relaxing in the later diastole that allows the continued filling of both sides of both ventricles. Then at the end of that, the first part of the systole, as we said, because the pacemaker is in the atria, the two atria contract first. And that's called atrial systole. And that pushes the last 10 or so percent of the blood into the ventricles and puts all of the blood that's going to be sent out into the ventricles. Then the two valves, the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve, close and the ventricles contract. And the ventricles send the blood out forcefully through the aorta and the pulmonic arteries. And then at this early diastole, the pulmonic and aortic valves close to prevent backflow, and then the filling begins again. So one complete round of systole and diastole is known as the cardiac cycle. Now the first, they talk about the heart sounds, the lub, dub. The first heart sound, the lub, is the closing of the mitral and tricuspid valves, and the dub is the closing of the aortic and pulmonic valves. We'll finish up with one diagram about the arteries and veins, or blood vessels. On the right is a vein, on the left is an artery. The vein is distinguished from the artery in two ways, one of which is the vein has much thinner walls with much thinner areas in each of the coats, and the artery is thicker walled. And the vein has a valve to prevent backflow. The artery does not. And you can see there are three layers or tunica. The tunica intima, which is the internal part of the blood vessel. The tunica media, which is the medium or the middle part, which has a smooth muscle that allows for vasoconstriction that we talked about before, and elastic fibers. And then the tunica externa, which has the connective tissue and elastic fibers. Now, small arteries still have all three tunics, and they're called arterioles, whereas venules are small veins that do not have all three of these layers. Now, another term that your book mentions that I wanted to mention is the vasa vasorum. The vasa vasorum is a group of blood vessels that are actually in the wall of larger blood vessels, particularly the aorta, that actually serve to bring oxygen to the external part of the blood vessel.